If you've listened to Serenbe Stories for a while, then today's guest, Phill Tabb, will need no introduction. For those who need a refresher, Phill is Professor Emeritus of Architecture at Texas A&M University and has been involved with Serenbe since its earliest days, creating the community's master plan using the principles of sacred geometry. He's the author of numerous publications, including Serene Urbanism, a biophilic theory and practice of sustainable placemaking, and Biophilic Urbanism, Designing Resilient Communities for the Future. His latest book is Thin Place Design, Architecture of the Numinous. This is an absolutely fascinating book in concept, all about the qualities that make a place extraordinary, magical, or profound. In this interview, Steve and I chat with Phill about serenity and awe, healing experiences in nature, and the thin place experience that he has right here in Serenbe.
Serenbe as a whole is a thin place. When you just come here and you begin to experience walking in the woods or driving down the Omega roads or whatever, something happens that is very special. And I think it's that larger kind of thin place experience that's going on. And to some it can be awe-inspired, and others it could be serene-inspired, especially if you came from the city.
Phill, you found your way back to our podcast studio. Welcome back.
Well, thank you. It's really great to be here again.
I know. We're so excited. You've got a new book out. And so we want to do a little bit of like Phill and a lot of thin places. So let's just dive right in. Thin place design, architecture of the numinous. What in the world is that about?
Well, it's about thin places to begin with. So you might ask, what is a thin place? And I didn't know about 5 or 6 years ago. I'd never really heard the term. But I have been studying sacred places for probably 20 years. And then I discovered through an author of a previous book that I wrote, she was a contributor, had mentioned thin places. And so I was in a conversation with her, and she was telling me about how thin places is a term that derived from the Irish and Irish Christianity. And so I thought, well, that was pretty interesting. And, you know, what is a thin place? So it's a place that has a kind of thin veil or barrier around it. So it's like a sacred place that has this veil around it that does not necessarily reveal itself. So you have to kind of approach it in the right way and then begin to see through the veil to begin to connect to, let's say, the sacred innards of the place. So it's really kind of a cool concept, I think. And
you got a whole book on it. A publisher thought good things, and we've dug in, and we actually made it in our Hamlet. It's one of the books that we're reading. Oh, so we're recommending it to all of our listeners beyond the podcast.
Well, if you go to the opposite, let's say a thick place. Mm-hmm. So what's a thick place? And a thick place would be one where it's far more difficult to access anything that is sacred. Let's say that you're so concerned with everyday problems and issues and noise and a loud environment and chaotic. And it's so difficult to be able to begin to get into that mindset or that emotional set of beginning to connect to the sacred. And so part of what a thin place is doing is making that relationship between, let's say, the secular world in which we live and the sacred much closer to one another so that they're accessible.
I love the cover because you have Rachel Garceau's sculpture down at the Motto Pond. And so tell us how, of all the places you've studied, and you chose that for the cover, and how you define that specific place as a thin place.
It's interesting because the cover has been doctored to a certain degree through Photoshop to enhance exactly what I was talking about. Rachel's sort of double arches that you see are beginning to define kind of the entryway, or maybe the veil. It's the veil, and it's the entry through the veil. So as you look at the cover and you see that image, you see down the center of Motto Hamlet. But part of what we enhanced is that there's a little green circle at the end of that. And we wanted to enhance that as the place that is really the destination of going through this threshold. And another thing we did was around the arches, we made the landscape black and white. Mm. So as you can see, that's black and white. And all of a sudden, as you go into the thin place, color and vitality begins to be your experience of it. So I thought it was a perfect image for the book, and I have really gotten a lot of positive feedback.
I love that.
It's dynamite.
We'll put a photo of that in our show notes, but talk to us a little bit about the emotional responses that people get to thin places. When you're having a thin place experience, like what does one feel typically?
I came at the emotional side of thin places through biophilia. And I know you've had a number of podcasts on biophilia, and there are the sometimes 25, sometimes 15 patterns of biophilia. And the last one that Bill Browning came up with was the pattern of awe. And so that led me into researching the concept of awe. And if you really look at the definition of biophilia, it is basically our relationship to nature, our love relationship with nature. And that's actually an emotion. So biophilia is about an emotional response to the natural environment and the natural processes. So it is an emotion. So that led me to studying emotions as an outcome, let's say, of a thin place experience. But in so doing that, I also found and felt that not only was awe an emotional response to sacred places or thin places, but also serenity. And they're almost on opposite ends of the scale. So that led me to looking at emotion theory. And there's a guy by the name of Plutchik who did an emotion wheel in 1962, and he identified 32 different emotions. And sometimes they're opposite one another. And among those emotions are equilibrium and love and submission and awe and disapproval and remorse, contempt, anger, and so on. But very close to being opposite are awe and serenity. And I felt that these two opposites were really fantastic outcomes of a sacred place, because sometimes we go there to be inspired, and that's where awe emotions come in. And other times we go there to really be more reflective and to heal. And so that's where serenity emotions come in. And I discovered that Decker Keltner and his group out of Berkeley, California, was studying awe emotions for about 19 years now. And also serenity research was actually done in the 1960s by the Nursing Association, where they found that serenity was a key objective in recovery rooms. So they were looking for ways to make these places, more serene. So now we have these two, and we have scientific data supporting both serene and awe emotions, which is explained in the book to some degree, but it gives it kind of the, credibility that these two opposite emotions are really important. Now, there are other tangential emotions. For example, with serenity, you have joy and optimism and love, ecstasy. These are some of the tangential ones to that. In awe, you have surprise and apprehension. And according to definitions of the Numinous, you also have fear.
Oh, sure.
So I like to sort of translate that into not so much being afraid or fear, but being awakened and alive. So it's like when you walk into the woods and you start hearing noises, and there's this animal instinct that begins to come up inside. And I don't think it's necessarily fear. I think it's apprehension, but it's also a kind of a vitality becoming really open to the place. Now, serenity doesn't do that. It almost does the opposite. You stand by a small stream or you look at some flowers and you get drawn into it. You get drawn into the beauty and the color and so on. So they're really kind of very different kinds of experiences.
And then I know that there's one of the more well-known studies on biophilia and the benefits of bringing nature into spaces was the one that was done in hospital rooms. Was that kind of some of the work that came out of this Serenity study? And then more recently, they've sort of said, if you have a view of nature in your room, you actually heal quicker, that, you get out of the hospital quicker.
The answer is no. That work was done by Roger Ulrich, who actually was one of my faculty at Texas A&M.
Okay.
And it was done in the 80s. And it was done independent of serenity and awe, but was done basically on what are ways in which you can increase the healing process, length of stay in a hospital room and lower stress levels and so on. And his was really cutting edge research in the 80s. And that's led to many of the principles, as you mentioned.
But I guess maybe I should have rephrased the question. So does a serenity reaction, emotion come out of the Ulrich that when I see nature out there, I have a more serene surrounding for my recovery?
It can. What if it was a picture of the Grand Canyon?
Right.
Then it's going to be more awe-inspiring.
Right.
But if it's a beautiful lilac meadow
That's
is going to be more
interesting.
serene. So again, it depends on the
I
quality
like that
of the image.
parsing of that.
And sometimes it can be art by itself.
Yes.
But for instance, what you have the combination of art and nature, which is really two of the things that really help create a thin place. And,
Yes, right.
and the serenity of a place.
Yeah. So I like both of them, and I think we go for different reasons. A guy by the name of Wiener talked about in a New York Times article about getting rid of your tourist guides when it comes to finding thin places. And just to go into nature, go into a building or go into a community like Serenbe and get rid of your expectations and just become open to the experience. And it's the same thing going into the woods. I mean, if you go there just open-minded, it's amazing how it begins to reveal itself to you. But if you go there with a certain amount of intentions, then you kind of lose it, I think.
And it's how different, because I think what we call our small waterfall is a thin place. However, the large waterfall is not. It has some aspects of awe, but it's not that same sense of thin place and mystery.
Well, I think they both do in using my definitions of awe-inspired versus serenity-inspired. Because you go to the larger waterfall and it has more noise and it has a greater presence. But then you go to the small waterfall and it really begins to bring you inside yourself. So anyway, I think they're two really good examples of the two different kinds of experiences.
Are there any other places within Serenbe that you think specifically are thin places?
Yes, because thin places can be socially constructed. So it doesn't necessarily have to be nature. For example, the fire pit, it has fire as a center. But I've been there many times, and you see something happening in that space with the people that are there. It's just very interesting.
You have a photo in your book about it, I realized. Yeah.
I do. And so there are many places. And in fact, when I went to Ireland, one of the things I read, and I thought this was very interesting, that most of the literature on thin places in Ireland is about specific places, certain wells and ruins that have been there for thousands of years. And yes, I did go to most of those that I could. They are very interesting. But one person observed that Ireland itself, particularly the Republic of Ireland itself, is a thin place. And they said it's surrounded by the oceans, it's surrounded by coastal mountains, and then it has this interior, this beautiful landscape interior. And so if you can view Ireland as a whole, as the island, then you see it as a thin place. So that led me to think about Serenbe in the same way, because Serenbe as a whole is a thin place. When you just come here and you begin to experience, walk in the woods or driving down the Omega roads or whatever, something happens that is very special. And I think it's that larger kind of thin place experience that's going on. And to some, it can be awe-inspired, and others, it could be serene-inspired, especially if you came from the city.
Right. And well, we just finished up Niagara Placemaking, which is the consulting group at Serenbe. And people always ask, how do you market it? How do you explain it? And it's very difficult. We always say, you just have to come. You really have to walk the land to really understand it.
And as we said goodbye to the various people, they're all talking about who they're needing to bring back. Their city council person, a partner, a finance person, and they said, oh my goodness, you really have to see it. And I think the big thing is, and probably within places, you feel it as much as you see it. And that's why pictures of Serenbe do not really capture it.
Yes. Yes. From a wellness benefit point of view, you get both cognitive stimulation here. You go into the woods and all of a sudden you're starting to think about things. You're thinking about nature, thinking about where you're living and what you should do and so on. But you also have this strong emotional response, which begins to some ways affect how you think. But at the same time, it's very different than just thinking about the place.
Well, that's why it's exciting with our artist in residence program. The artists that come here and spend time, and many times they have transformative work that happens and they attribute it back to their time here.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's magical. And magic is, I guess, another one of the kind of emotions that happens. It's hard to say where it is in the, let's say, serenity to awe scale. Magic can be very powerful. So then it would be more on the awe scale. And it can be very small. I use as an example in the book as a thin place is a birthday cake. And I thought that it was a wonderful way to share with people that thin places don't necessarily mean going to the Grand Canyon. which is obviously a thin place. But think of this was my grandson's 3rd birthday that I went to. Think of a 3-year-old, and it's all day you've been told this is your day, right? This is a very special day for you. You're 3 years old. Who knows what a 3-year-old knows about that other than what he's told? And so all of a sudden, you have the party and you have the friends and you do all the activities around it. And then you have the birthday cake and the lights dim and everybody crowds around you. And then the birthday cake is brought in and you have all the candles there, and they're all flickering. And in his case, all 3 of them were flickering. And then you're asked to make a wish. Okay, think of a 3-year-old making a wish. Mm-hmm. Now, where does that 3-year-old go for that wish? It's kind of hard for me to remember back when I was 3 years old. But they obviously go somewhere.
Right.
And then they get a great big breath, and then they blow.
Yep.
And to me, that is a magical thin place moment. The whole thing, that's a stage set for a thin place moment.
Mm-hmm. And the focus, to your point, like the lights come down, the focus is just on the child and that cake.
And think of the internal experience that 3-year-old is having. Mm-hmm. Everything is just so focused, and now it's down to these flickering candles.
And the magic of a flickering candle, that always pulls anyone in at any age.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Phill, talk to us a little bit about thin places and your other deep passion, sacred geometry. Do they intersect? How does that work? Like, what have you sort of learned in your thin places work of how sacred geometry fits in?
I'll start with the idea that you cannot have a place without geometry. Geometry exists everywhere, right? So
yeah, that's true.
So if you're focusing on sacred geometry, then what you're saying is, let's say there's a thin place, which is a place.
Right.
So geometry can be one of the characteristics or one of the organizing qualities of that place. Mm-hmm. For example, the Grand Canyon is a linear edge. So it's an edge place. So the geometry is a line, right? Mm. So what is sacred about that? Well, it's sacred in the sense that it has such a powerful experience. And you're looking at this deep, 1 mile deep canyon. So that's where geometry, and it's more natural geometry, the geometry of labyrinths and mazes and a certain, let's say, religious buildings, the geometry of them, begins to contribute to the power of the place, or the power of your experience of the place.
There's so many cathedrals or chapels, or the geometry is incredible, whether that's the stained glass or the way that the transept is laid out. Do you have any ones that you can think of off the top of your head?
Well, the Blue Mosque in Istanbul was incredibly powerful. And it doesn't have like the strong altar. It has the dome geometry. And I think a lot of Islamic patterning and Islamic mosque really have very powerful geometry that is designed to contribute to a transcendent experience. In other words, you go in, you look at the ceiling, and it's designed in a way for you to dissolve your sense of being in a certain place in time, and almost that it's dissolving into the heavens above, which in a way it's reflecting. And it does have that ability. And some of that geometry, you start following your eye down some of the geometry, and it leads you back to the center, and it leads you away, and it leads you back in. And so this process, this visual process of going in and out, again, helps for transformation.
Right. What else in the book do you want to share with us that sort of has been striking individuals as they're reading it? Like, what's sort of bubbling to the top that's interesting to you?
Well, I think what makes it a little bit different than other books on thin places, and there are not a lot of them out there, is that it attempts to take a look at a lot of scales. So it looks at the urban design scale. And so we don't think very often of thin places being at the urban design scale. And I gave the example of Serenbe and the entire island of Ireland as being this larger scale as a thin place. And then it gets in, architecture is usually in landscapes, are usually the context where we think of most about the thin places. But I also brought it into what I was calling everyday experiences, because I think that's really important for people. Not everybody's going to go to Ireland to experience those places. And not everybody's going to go to the Grand Canyon next week. So what is it you're going to do today, or what is it you can do this week that is going to give you exposure to, let's say, a thin place experience? And they're all over the place. And part of it is your own state of mind. So what is it you're bringing to it? And the degree to which you can, let's say, decrease the veil, the thinness of the veil. And then there are other places, like at Serenbe, we've got probably hundreds of places that can actually be a thin place. I walk on one of the trails in the woods, and there's this stump that comes out that looks like a dragon. And every time I go by there, I stop. And it makes me, in a way, just stop and think about this dragon, and my imagination begins to kick off. I also walk by, by the tree houses. You'll notice that there's a large bamboo stand near there. I go by, I talk to the bamboo every time I go by.
Okay.
And I talk to them as the weather changes, and I say, hey, I got to get ready for this cold weather coming. And then when the spring comes, I say, okay, now you get to charge out. And then a little bit further down past the little waterfalls, right on the trail is a granite rock outcrop. And you just walk over it. Most people probably wouldn't even notice it. But there is a rock outcrop there. And I have dedicated that to my grandparents, my 4 grandparents. So every time I walk over those, I stop and I talk to each of my 4 grandparents. And I say, hey, I'm still alive. I'm doing okay here. How you doing wherever you are? And so these elements in the landscape are, in a way, created by the landscape and created by me and my own experience of it. So I think everyday people can do the same thing in their lives, even if it's in your backyard, or I suggest to people that they have a space in their house that's a very special place for them. For me, it's a chair. I have a chair, which is my sacred place. I mean, once I'm in that chair, it's like I'm really there.
Right.
So if everybody can have a place in their own house that's really their place, you have the opportunity to have these thin place experiences, I think.
Yeah, no, I love that. Where's your place, Steve? What's your thin place?
Well, in all of Serenbe, it's the little waterfall. I mean, that has so much energy of both the hard rock foundation, which you related to, but there's also a mystery in the air that I don't find as much other places.
I agree. I've got another thin place that's yours, I think.
Yeah?
It's the gator with your 5 grandkids. When I see you in that gator going by.
6 grandkids.
6, sorry. Yeah, it's in the gator with the 6 grandkids.
Well, and the great fun is on the highest dirt pile that we can find out in the construction site. They go do construction inspections with me. I mean, we've done that since Amos was 18 months old. And we continue to do that. And I have pictures from this Saturday, and we're on the great mounds of earth. And there's something magical about that.
Isn't that amazing? A kid sees a mound and then you got to run and go up to the top, right? And see what's there and look around and then roll down or whatever.
Right.
At my age, I kind of say, that's a nice picture from my iPhone.
Yeah. Do you think your new, what we refer lovingly as the Steve Kano, or the new high?
You mean the mound
yes,
that
exactly.
we decided to leave. And that was sort of my surprise for everyone when I imagined that. And then we have added a trampoline. And so I think that's a magic place, not only for the people that are bouncing on it. And you notice almost at sunset every night, there are people there. But it's also magical for those people driving by and not quite realizing at first.
What is it?
Why are these people bouncing in the air on top of that mound? And it takes a minute to realize, there must be a trampoline up there, but it's not obvious.
Yeah. I think it's great because it's a landscape element that you would think, you should flatten that out, so that the landscape can be quite picturesque. But it isn't. It's in contrast to that. And I think it's challenging to kids. I mean, it's in a positive way.
Well, one thing that, as you mentioned, all of Serenbe tends to be a thin place, but it's that magic that you and I have worked on, and you really helped me introduce the importance of contemporary architecture, and as we relate it into the more traditional in each area, and that has created that very interesting place that pulls people in a different way.
And the color of motto, for example, color is another one of those elements that can contribute to a thin place experience. It can also detract. But one of the things I didn't mention earlier about emotions is that there's negative emotions. I think the Berkeley Center also tries to stay away from the negative emotions. And most of the research that I've done on thin places stays away from the negative emotions. So when we're looking at what are the positive and wellness and healing aspects of these thin places.
Do you think that, because I'm sort of trying to think through, that the blue folly on the hill out in Motto that you can see from the center of the manor homes, Anders Court, and even the lights that are hanging there that Robert Rausch did, Steve, with the blue tops. I mean, would you consider those
Well, I would consider going from Anders Court all the way down over to the Blue Pyramid as a thin place experience. You're going through a whole succession of spaces.
Yeah.
And almost each space is a thin place in itself, starting with Anders Court, right? Or even starting with the Healing Garden, for that matter. So you've got this whole sequence. It's almost like a beaded necklace. You know, so each one of these little beads on there is a thin place, has a potential for a thin place experience.
And it brings about different emotions depending on the time of the day. And if you go now at sunset, and then again when it's really dark and you see all the lights and the mystery of those lights in Anders Court, it's very magical.
Yeah. Well, another thing in the book I wrote about was because we have controls of night lighting here, where you can actually see the night sky. How many people are really not allowed to see the night sky because of the urban context within which they live? And when you see the night, you see the stars, you see the moon going by, that I think is transformative because it gets you to think outside of yourself. According to Kiltner and his group, they call it sort of going beyond the small self. And that's what the Grand Canyon does. You're there, you're so small to this landscape that you begin to forget your troubles and to forget the things that are affecting you personally. And all of a sudden that you're actually connected to this thing that's much larger. So the night walking around Serenbe, my house is right on the edge of Crossroads. And at night, if I go left towards Selborne, I mean, it's pitch black out there. And it's really cool. I love the fact that it's just totally black.
That reminds me, there's probably a place that we don't think of, but there's probably a thin place that's introduced to more public people. And that's especially people from outside Serenbe that dine at the Hill. And as they're leaving at night, I've seen so many people stop and look up at the night sky. And you realize they've come from places that they're not used to seeing the stars. And they'll stand there sometimes for 15 minutes, just gazing, sometimes in quiet awe, sometimes sharing comments with people. And there's probably more people that we've introduced through that portal standing there. And I've never thought about that stoop outside the Hill door, but it truly is at night.
That is. That's a great one.
So, Phill, as we're wrapping up here, I know this book just came out, but, you know, I always have to ask, what's next? What are you working on right now? Or is there anything you can discuss with listeners?
I think I can. Actually, I'm about to go into contract on my 8th book, and the title is still up for grabs. But right now, it's something like Wellness, Architecture, and Urban Design. And I've been working almost 2 years, maybe a little longer than 2 years, with the Global Wellness Institute on a white paper on a topic that's similar to this. And one of the other authors and I have decided that we thought it'd be a really good idea to make this into a book. So right now we're at about 55,000 words.
Wow.
And I think it's a pretty exciting book because it goes into a lot of detail about what are the benefits of wellness design. And 2 is it goes into, again, this broad set of scales from cities to neighborhoods, to buildings, to landscapes, to interiors. Those are all the scales where wellness can manifest. It has a lot of design guides for each of those scales. And then the last one, which I'm most excited about, is a case study on Motto as a wellness neighborhood. And how many wellness neighborhoods do you see? New neighborhoods do you see now that are totally dedicated to health and wellness and have not only the form of the place, but its relationship to nature and the facilities that are there that are all in support of this concept of wellness. And so I'm excited about digging deep into that.
I love it. That's really exciting. Well, anything else that you want to share with us? I mean, I guess usually we ask the final question, but I feel like we've talked about it the whole time of what should people go do when you're here at Serenbe? Maybe they should find their own thin place.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I was thinking about doing a workshop, and part of that workshop was going to be to give the participants, let's say, the ammunition about what's the anatomy of a thin place.
Great.
But then to, again, eliminate your expectations, and then either to find it in your home or find it somewhere in Serenbe, in the woods or wherever. It could be in a corner in Hulsa. I don't know where everybody's thin place is.
Sure.
But for them to begin to be aware of when the kind of transformative emotions begin to percolate. And I thought that would be something really quite good. So
let's do it.
Yeah. So for people, again, it's just get rid of your expectations, experience nature, and experience your own home in a new way. Look at it in a new way.
Mm-hmm.
Just be aware of where you feel really comfortable and safe, and where you really feel like, where do you go when you're sick? Would be another way to place this. Where do you go when you're really ill that helps your wellness?
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's the bath or my chair. Those are the two things, or my garden.
I was going to say, Phill, what about your garden?
Yeah.
I mean, that is...
Yeah. I do go there when I'm ill, but it's really more of a wellness place. It's there to support my wellness rather than my illness. So, yeah, it's my garden. And putting my hands in the earth and trimming flowers and going out there and getting vegetables and stuff is like really, really nice.
And, one place we haven't talked about is the labyrinth.
Yep.
And it reminds me here, a couple of years ago, I encountered a family at the Daisy, and it was a full family, and I didn't think anything of it, just I didn't recognize them. And they stopped me and they said, our whole family has come together today, and I want to share with you why we're here. When their mother was diagnosed with cancer, the only place she found comfort was walking the labyrinth. And she lived about 10 miles from here. And she made an effort to come once a week to walk the labyrinth. And so the 1-year anniversary of her death, the family came together to walk the labyrinth.
Isn't that nice?
So that was a thin place that represented something very special. And they say it was so healing and comforting to her.
Yeah.
And she was able to accept the death that was ahead of her.
And again, a labyrinth is a microcosm of the whole thin place experience, because you enter it from the secular world, right? Mm-hmm. And then you step over the threshold into it and you begin your journey.
That's right.
And then that journey is a process of letting go. Mm-hmm. And then you get to the center, and usually by that time you're in a different place, right? Emotionally.
It's transformative.
Yeah.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you again, Phill.
Oh,
we always enjoy having you on, and everybody go buy the book. We'll put a link in the show notes for you.
It's a beautifully produced book, by the way. This is, I think, one of Rutledge's best books. About 5 years ago, they didn't do color.
Oh.
And it's an academic publisher, so most of their books were written words and black and white photographs. And then the last two books, this one and then the Biophilic Urbanism book, I talked them into doing color. But the color quality in this one is really quite excellent.
That's great.
It's very good. So, well, it's times like this that I always want to say to you publicly again, thanks for coming to Serenbe and sharing your magic and helping us create all of Serenbe as a thin place for everyone who lives here and those who want to just visit for a moment. So thank you, Phill.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's a pleasure to be here. And I don't think if I'd moved here that I would have evolved in the same way that I have, because Serenbe has done its magic to me as well.
It's great.
Yep. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.